So yeah, I can do that now. Anyways, welcome back to the third and final part of What If Everything Went Perfect for Rome. If you haven't watched the first two parts already, the links for those will be in the description below. And for those who have watched the previous parts, Emperor Kalos unfortunately cannot make it out for the rest of the series, but don't worry, because I have someone else that will be helping me out for the rest of the series. The one, the only, Gary!
Hi, thanks, Ark.
For everyone who hasn't watched the High Schools Do an Alternate Congress of Vienna video gone wrong, which you should definitely watch by the way, the link will also be in the description below. Gary sometimes helps out behind the scenes and will be helping me out for the rest of the series. Quick warning, his audio is absolutely awful, but we're just gonna ignore that. So without further ado, Gary, take it away.
With the dawn of the 9th century comes the start of the true Roman Industrial Revolution, with the first trains and railway systems being built connecting major cities like the city of Rome and Constantinople to the other cities nearby. And steam power as a whole would also be adopted by most industries across the empire. I'm not going to go into too many specifics about the different technologies and stuff that will be invented like Ark has done previously up to this point, because it will just be a repeat of how Britain industrialized in our timeline. But what I will talk about are the specific differences that will occur in Rome that didn't happen in Britain. For starters, it's important to know the industrialization in Britain only really happened in its core territory and not across its giant colonial empire, where it did later on, which just mainly used for the resources in it to help fuel industrialization. But in this timeline, industrialization would happen all across the entire Roman Empire over time, with the Romans extracting resources from their own empire as well as through trade with China and India, meaning the Romans' industrialization would be similar to the American industrialization in our timeline, with it taking around 200 years-ish for industrialization to fully spread across the empire, instead of the 80 years it took for Britain's core territory to fully industrialize. The provinces that would first start to industrialize are mainly the core provinces that have contributed the most to Rome's industry up to this point, which would be northern Italia, central and northern Gallia, southern Britannia, Carthage, Egypt, around Alexandria on the Nile, and western Anatolia, with the rest of the empire either just beginning to industrialize or barely industrialized at all by the end of the century. Also, now that steam-powered engines are invented, that also means that steamships would also be invented, which would help drastically speed up the process of colonization of the Americas by using them to set up more port colonies in the Americas, as well as across Africa, the South Pacific, and Scandinavia, etc. By being able to travel much faster than the wooden sailboats used in our timeline, they would make the process of making these ships much faster by taking their existing fleets and converting them to steam-powered ships, so that way by the end of the century, the Roman Navy will have hundreds of them to use to expand their influence across the world. Over in the Americas, and the Romans would end up spreading European diseases to the native tribes such as the Aztecs, Incas, etc., as they start setting up their first settlements and exploring around the areas they colonized. The diseases the natives would get, though, would not be as bad as in our timeline, and also by this point there weren't really any complex native civilizations like the ones that existed in our timeline when the Europeans would arrive in the Americas in our timeline, so it wouldn't affect the natives as badly in our timeline. However, millions of natives would still die in this timeline. Over time, the Romans would found more port colonies and settle the land around them, while also starting expeditions around their settlements to map and eventually claim new lands. Rome could then start to settle the land they claim and eventually develop proper colonies, which they will mainly do around the St. Lawrence River, following a similar pattern that France did in our timeline with their New France colony. For France, it took them about 74 years, give or take, in our timeline to establish their New France colony, and this was long before they industrialized and developed the steamships that Rome developed. So the Romans would be able to colonize the Americas much faster and efficiently compared to the Europeans in our timeline. The Romans would also be able to start to colonize southern Greenland in order to have more people to use for ship maintenance and better logistics for transporting more people to the New World. Towards the end of the century, the Romans would settle the east coast, adding it as an extension to the St. Lawrence River settlements. There would still be native resistance in this timeline, which would be much harder for the Romans to deal with because although they aren't really any advanced indigenous civilizations, they would still be much more natives in this timeline. But by now, because of the Industrial Revolution, guns would have been invented and would be mass-produced and integrated into the army and brought over to their settlements. The Romans would also resort many times to peaceful integration of native tribes into their colonies to avoid having to fight against them, as well as using them to learn more about the land and the available resources around them, also to avoid having the Roman colonies rebel like the European colonies did in their timeline. The Roman colonies will eventually gain province status in the future after they are able to develop faster communication using the telephone, which would be around the corner being invented by this point. Moving back to Europe, and the Roman Empire will begin to Romanize some of their puppet kingdoms so that they can be integrated into their empire now that they have served their purpose in acting as a buffer states to defend the empire. And by the end of the century, all of these similar puppet kingdoms will be able to be integrated, and with the Romans needing an increased presence in the Nile to better gain access to its resources. The Romans would also annex all of their Eastern African puppet kingdoms to be able to start to control more of the Sahara Desert, which they will start to do over the course of the next century. In Scandinavia, with all of the trade that has happened between the Viking tribes and Rome, since the Viking Age began, they are able to advance and unite into countries much earlier than they are in our timeline, thanks to the common culture from the help of Rome, who, you guessed it, turns them into puppet kingdoms. By the end of the century, the Romans would also start Romification efforts in their Germanic puppet kingdoms, as well as in some of their Central Asian puppets. China would also be able to successfully integrate some of their puppets into their territory as well, while also conquering and eventually annexing the Tibetan regions, along with the Eastern Indo-Chinese countries, which would have been causing them a lot of problems for centuries by now. India would also start to expand more to conquer the rest of Tibet in the south of the Himalayas, and puppeting all of the countries in Western Indochina. By the end of the century, both China and India would start to be able to get industrialized technologies from Rome and follow in their footsteps and having industrial revolutions of their own eventually. I'm now going to pass it back to Alterarc to go over the next century with you guys.
During the beginning of the 10th century, it would have been a full century since the first industrial revolution began in Rome, and they would now be technologically similar to the Europeans during the late 1800s, meaning that they would now have started the second industrial revolution. During this century, much more of the less industrialized populations of Rome would also start to catch up to the rest of Rome throughout the century, making Rome officially a truly industrialized empire by the end of the century. By now, railroads would have been built to be able to connect to a lot of the industrialized parts of the Roman Empire, drastically changing how trade and military transportation work within the empire. With better military transportation, the Romans would be able to use it to pacify and integrate tribes within the Arabian desert like the Najd and Rupali Kahila tribes. I definitely pronounced those correctly. In order to have a better control over the Arabian desert. By doing this, Roman railroads and Oasis outputs would be able to eliminate nomadic raids to connect Mesopotamia, Egypt, and East Africa much better. Rome would also finish Romanizing their Germanic puppet kingdom and eventually integrate it into the empire, along with a couple of puppets in Asia, to have more direct control over some of the Western Silk Road when they start to build railways across the Silk Road for faster trade with India and China. China would also be able to finally integrate all of their Eastern Turkic puppet kingdom into their empire, as well as conquer some of the last remnants of the Turkic Kaganic tribes with Rome, which would have been causing plenty of border skirmishes over the past couple of centuries. After Rome and China conquer it, they would then divide the territory along the Yenisei River. As you can see here, the Chinese got as short of a hand here as their heights are. I'm allowed to make that joke because I'm 5'6", and one of my friends is Asian. Over in the Americas, and progress towards the colonization of the Americas would rapidly increase because of all the advancements that the Romans would make this century, because of the Second Industrial Revolution that helped them out with the colonization of the Americas. Once the automobile is invented, instead of it being only a luxury the rich could afford, which would be the case back in Europe, the Romans would build factories in their New World colonies to produce those automobiles that would be owned by their colonial government, and then use them to travel and settle more inward areas that the Romans could use to mine more resources to sell back to Europe, as well as explore new areas. The Romans would continue the colonization efforts by integrating the Iroquois tribes, as well as settling around the Great Lakes. They would also discover South America if they haven't already, and start to found port colonies in the northwest of South America. Afterwards, the Romans would start to explore and settle parts of the northwest of South America that are rich in resources and use them for mining operations, while also colonizing the Caribbean, so that way ships from the empire could just cross the Atlantic Ocean like Christopher Columbus did in our timeline, and make bases like the Romans did in Iceland and Greenland that will be used to help specifically colonize South America and send its resources back to the empire. By the end of the century, the Industrial Revolution would have spread across the empire, making Rome a fully industrialized power. With an industrialized Rome comes the spreading of the Industrial Revolution into the Gupta Empire and the Tang Dynasty, as the Romans now begin to enter the Third Industrial Revolution, which I will leave to Gary to talk about in the next century.
Over the course of the 11th century, Rome begins to expand into the Sahara Desert by taking control over the Sahel trade routes and annexing Sahel tribes like the Germanics in order to expand their influence in Africa. Over in the Americas, Rome would continue to develop their St. Lawrence River and Eastern Great Lake settlements while also mapping out the Mississippi River system, claiming it, beginning to settle the eastern parts of it, further expanding their influence in the Americas by setting outposts all across the Mississippi River for resupplying their ships, as well as eventually becoming the beginnings of future settlements across North America. The Mississippi River system would also be important in mapping out the inner territories of North America, while also helping to reach South America much easier than before from some of their settlements by boats. They would also use their Caribbean island colonies to make contacts with the Mayan, Toltec, and Mexican city-state tribes. Last of all, they would also expand northern South America, taking over all parts that have the most valuable resources to bring back to the empire. In the Silk Road, Rome, China, and India would finish replacing the Silk Road with their railway system, which would massively speed up trade between the three empires, with the Romans moving into their puppet kingdoms in the Silk Road. It drastically speeds up the Romification process because of the increased population of Romans from the empire, which will eventually lead to all of the big kingdoms located on the Silk Road gradually being annexed over time into the empire. With China's newfound industrial power, they will have a much easier time integrating their Tibetan puppet kingdoms into their Indochina puppet kingdoms into their empire compared to their Western Turkic puppet kingdoms, and officially annexing them into their empire. India would also annex their portion of Indochina into their empire. India and China would sign a treaty dividing all of the South Pacific, with China getting the Philippines and everything north of it, and India getting everything south of the Philippines. China would then go on to conquer all of modern-day Filipino islands, and the Gupta Empire will conquer most of modern-day Indonesia. India would also continue to expand their influence by developing steamships mapping out all of East Asia and even discovering Oceania. As a result, Rome would inevitably lose its influence in the South Pacific and the Indian Ocean to the Indians and Chinese, which is okay because there's no need for them to have influence over that anymore. Anyways, now that the Indians and the Chinese will completely control the South Pacific soon, and they're focused on expanding their influence in the Americas and in Africa, so they will slowly put away their South Pacific outposts to redirect those resources to further developing their influence in the Americas and Africa. Speaking of Africa, by the end of the century, the Romans would be able to take control over all Saharan tribes and the trade routes necessary to fully conquer it by the end of the century. Along with the Horn of Africa, keep in mind that the Romans will not be settling the Sahara Desert, and the only colonization efforts happening would be settling the habitable parts of the Horn of Africa and having Romans within the Sahara Desert controls and maintaining all the Sahara trade routes. One thing I would like to know is that if we were to follow the exact timeline of industrialization the Europeans did, then midway through this century, the Romans would start the third industrial revolution. However, in this timeline, it would be delayed a bit because of what helped propel the Europeans to the third industrial revolution was both the World Wars and the Cold War, because of all the new technologies that were discovered and developing their military technologies that was later used to be able to be used for civilian applications in this timeline. The third industrial revolution would be delayed towards the end of this century because the only wars the Romans would need to fight are against small native tribes in the Americas and what's left of the Turkic tribes, along with any other nomadic tribe, as well as their expansion into the Sahara Desert. With that, we end this century with Rome beginning the third industrial revolution and Rome beginning efforts to build the necessary logistics to be able to explore and colonize Africa, which Alterarc will talk about next.
At the beginning of the 12th century, the Third Industrial Revolution would start to really kick off. By this point, ships would be much faster and planes would have been invented, making transportation much faster across the empire and to the Americas. And with the invention of the telephone, communication across the empire is now instant. Also, satellites are launched into space and are able to map out the world, including the regions that Rome hasn't discovered yet. So, yeah, just like that, the age of discovery has come to an end. They finished the discovery part. Anyways, as a result of all these new technologies being invented, the Romans will now be able to reorganize their colonies as well as claim the uninhabitable parts of the Americas and either grant them territory status or integrate them into their colonies. After the colonies are reorganized, the Romans will officially grant them provincialhood, meaning they will officially be represented within the Roman Empire, which could potentially prevent a future revolution from happening like what happened in our timeline. Through the poor colony settlements that were founded across the St. Lawrence River, settlements start to form all across the St. Lawrence River, with the first ones developing in Central America and then spreading to the northeast of Louisiana, as well as the south of Louisiana. And then by the time the century ends, the entire Louisiana territory would have been colonized and integrated into the Roman Empire as provinces. The Romans would also conquer the rest of the Andes, which is also rich in gold, similar to the northern Andes that they would have already conquered. Over in Africa, and Rome wouldn't do much with it at first because they were mainly focused on colonizing the Americas. However, they do develop the logistics to be able to conquer the more sparsely populated Sahel region, as well as explore more of Central Africa. Over in Oceania, the Indians would be focused on conquering Oceania and would succeed in conquering New Guinea, as well as parts of Australia and New Zealand, along with some surrounding islands over the course of the century. China will also start launching campaigns and will conquer the Japanese islands and Sakhalin, as well as the Korean peninsula over the course of the century, and would start to plan to conquer Manchuria sometime next century. By the end of the century, since the Third Industrial Revolution happened in 1950 in our timeline, that means that if the Third Industrial Revolution happened at the end of the 11th century, then Rome would theoretically have even more advanced technology than we do, and would have the same level of technology as we did in 2060, over 800 years earlier in this timeline. That means that from here on out, I can't really predict what technologies will be invented, but for the sake of the scenario, we will assume that AI doesn't take over the world during the Fourth Industrial Revolution and collapses Roman society. In the 13th century, the Romans would integrate the Central American tribes into their empire and colonize all the habitable parts of Mexico and California to connect all of their American provinces together and mine all of the gold in California and Mexico. By the next century, the Romans would have claimed and colonized the rest of South America, officially completing one of Rome's most historic feats, which is the ending of the Roman colonization of the Americas. Moving back to Africa, we could have three scenarios play out. The first scenario would be that the Roman Empire wouldn't be that interested in colonizing Africa because they already control all of North America, most of South America by this point, most of Europe, a large portion of Asia, and roughly a third of Africa. If the Romans choose this option, then they could focus more inward on developing their provinces and their America's populations more to make them even more important parts of the empire, while only having soft power over Africa. The second option would be to do what the Europeans did in our timeline and divide up Africa into colonies, which in this timeline would mean dividing Africa up between India, China, and Rome. By doing this, all three of the great powers wouldn't have to settle in Africa if they don't want to, but could exploit it for their resources like what happened in our timeline. The third option would be for the Romans to slowly colonize Africa over time like they did in the Americas until they colonized the entire continent. Whatever happens, I'll leave it up to you guys, but it would really all depend on whether or not India, China, and Rome would be interested in Africa because of all of the land they conquered over the last few centuries, which could lead them to wanting to focus on developing those lands more instead of colonizing a bunch of new land, though I'm sure that one day, one way or another, the great powers would do something with the rest of Africa. Over in Oceania, India would fully colonize all of Australia over the course of the century. India and China would also divide all the islands in the Pacific Ocean and use them to create better shipping routes to trade with Roman's American provinces. China would also go on to conquer all of Manchuria throughout the century as well, and Rome by this point would have Romanized and annexed all of the rest Turkic puppet kingdoms into their empire. After that, towards the end of the century, they would then negotiate with China to split the rest of Siberia, with them splitting Siberia along the Yenisei River, with China annexing the east of the Yenisei River, and Rome annexing the rest of the Yenisei River and east of the Ural Mountains, meaning that Asia has now been fully split and colonized between the three great powers of the world. Although this is a major achievement, it will be nothing compared to what will happen in the next century. Scandinavia, January 1st, 1305. As the clock strikes midnight, the Scandinavians, now Romans, celebrate their official accession into the empire and watch on the news as the emperor officially proclaims them as part of the Roman Empire. Eastern Europe, January 1st, 1315. The Khazars and the Avars, now Romans, celebrate their official accession into the empire. Rome, March 21st, 1320. The Roman Emperor and the Senate ordered most of Rome's military to be diverted back to the core of the empire. Rome, May 1st, 1320. All of the necessary forces are moved into the core of the empire. Eastern Europe, May 2nd, 1320. Roman troops begin to be transported into the outposts that the Avars and the Khazars have used to defend the empire from barbarians up to this point. The Baltic Sea, May 10th, 1320. Most of the Roman navy is ordered to divert back to the Baltic Sea. The Ural Mountains, May 15th, 1320. Roman soldiers begin to arrive in newly built outposts built in the Ural Mountains. The Baltic Sea, June 8th, 1320. All the necessary Roman naval ships arrive in the naval outposts across the Baltic Sea. Eastern Europe, June 13th, 1320. All of the necessary Roman military units are transported into outposts in the Avar and Khazar provinces. The Ural Mountains, June 28th, 1320. All of the necessary Roman military units are transported to the military outposts across the Ural Mountains. Rome, July 1st, 1320, 11 o'clock a.m. The final session of Congress is held, where the elite upper class that makes up the Senate continues its last furious debate between what is morally right and Rome's destiny. Rome, July 1st, 1320, 12 o'clock p.m. After an intense one-hour debate, a decision is finally made and the emperor is notified. Rome, July 1st, 1320, 12:10 p.m. Word is spread to the Roman military to prepare to mobilize. Rome, July 15th, 1320, 12 o'clock p.m. The Roman military and navy has fully mobilized and have taken their positions and are awaiting further orders from the emperor. Rome, July 15th, 1320, 1 o'clock p.m. The emperor announces that they will be holding an important press conference later that night at 9 o'clock p.m. to address the Roman people personally in the Colosseum regarding the military mobilization that has occurred over the past year and the future of Rome. Rome, July 15th, 1320, 7 o'clock p.m. Inside and outside of the Colosseum, the largest crowd to have ever formed in the history of Rome and the world, is formed with tens of millions of Romans that have come across the entire Roman Empire, overflowing the Colosseum. Romans are even allowed to crowd the actual stage of the Colosseum so that more people could see the emperor's speech in person. The Roman people know exactly what the emperor is going to announce. Billions of Romans believe that what is about to happen is for the greater good of Rome and the world, while billions of other Romans believe that this will bring nothing but pain and suffering to innocent lives. Rome, July 15th, 1320, 8 o'clock p.m. Massive protests for and against what the emperor is about to announce have erupted across the empire, and the Roman government is having a tough time putting them out because a large portion of the military are mobilized across Eastern Europe. Rome, July 15th, 1320, 8:10 p.m. The emperor and all of the members of the Senate begin to be transported to the Colosseum by helicopter in order to get over the massive crowd that has formed. Rome, July 15th, 1320, 8:50 p.m. Over the past half an hour, the crowd that has formed inside and outside the Colosseum cheers as each member of the Senate is safely transported to the center of the Colosseum. Last of everyone to arrive is the Roman Emperor himself. Emperor Caesar Maximus Romulus Remus Decimus Augustus Aurelius III arrives by helicopter and goes down the rope like the badass he is. Rome, July 15th, 1320, 9 o'clock p.m. After a few minutes of getting set up, the emperor steps up to the mic and begins his speech. My fellow Romans, for over 2 millennia, this empire started from just a small settlement right here on these grounds to what it is today. We have conquered the entire Mediterranean, the entirety of North and South America, and half of Africa and Asia. We have been the downfall of empires, and we have risen new ones. We have been able to do this because of what we believe Romans can do. We can break mountains, we can tame seas, and we can conquer the world. Each and every one of us has given their lives to the empire. We have upheld the responsibility to ensure democracy prevails and prospers, no matter how much the world has changed. We have also upheld the responsibility to ensure that one day all the countries of the world will put down their guns and hold hands under eternal peace. We have done that by civilizing the barbaric world, through conquering and integrating the barbarians in the Americas, Western Asia, and Northern Africa, to spreading our culture to the Indians and the Chinese, who have also taken on the mantle to civilize the barbaric world, as well in Eastern Asia and in the South Pacific, and in more recent years, we have gained proxy control over all of the African barbarians as well, spreading our civilization to them through diplomacy and war. Now, I ask you, the Roman people, to take your place among your ancestors and stand with me in taking one of the last steps in achieving Pax Romana, to spread peace and prosperity to the rest of Europe, to lead us to a path where we can unite the world under the glory of the empire. Therefore I, Caesar Maximus Romulus Remus Decimus Augustus Aurelius III, with the approval of 59% of Congress, declare the last war. I declare war on the last barbarians. This is Europe. Not in this timeline, but in our timeline. I wanted to show you all this map to show you that this is what happens when society collapses. All these tiny little countries on this map are the ashes of what once was the Roman Empire, all forced to fight in endless wars, even to this day. I see many people praying for the downfall of the United States of America, and although I understand their frustrations, and trust me, I do, I like to show them this map, full of countries too small to even map, and I tell them that this is what happens when society collapses. It has always seemed like something of fiction that just happens in the movies and will never happen in our timeline. But it did, and each and every person watching this has a responsibility to make sure that this never happens again, to ensure that democracy prevails and prospers as it once did, to ensure that one day all the countries of the world will put down their guns and hold hands under eternal peace. At the end of the day though, this scenario is nothing but fiction. We only have one timeline, and we all must do everything in our power to upkeep it. Unfortunately though, our fate is yet to be decided, and if things don't go our way and the world returns to a map like this, I hope that in another universe, if one exists, we make it out alright. And even more so, I hope that a universe exists like this one that me, Gary, and Emperor Kalos had the honor of showing you, where society doesn't collapse, that Europe is not divided, but united under the glory of Rome, that one day Rome would unite with India, China, and the rest of Africa to unite the world under one nation and one people. But until then, May 29th, 1493 is just another day for the Roman Empire. But in our timeline, it was the day where this tiny little speck on this map met its fate. The day when the dying light of the Roman Empire was blown out forever.